Well, firstly, let me thank the Maharaj as well as my friends in the Department of History for having invited me to speak to you on this occasion. Even though it's considered important that you should learn from me, I assure you that it is as important that I should learn from you, in the sense that most of the time, in such cases, whenever we deal with our subjects in history or in related areas, the conversation is with ourselves or with a very, very few people who are part of our set and who sometimes have time, sometimes don't have time. Hence, to give attention to this kind of subject for a substantial period of time is very rare to come by. On certain occasions, when you write about the subject, you may be, again, dealing with a larger audience, but as you can understand, writing is writing. It's not quite the same as having a discussion or an exchange. So I look forward to some of the questions that you may have. Some of them may be complex questions. As far as I can see, there are complex questions that you have thought of. I understand this from the nature of the material which is on the wall magazine. So if there are things which somehow don't quite sound adequately satisfying to some of the interests that you have, and at the same time are not really being dealt with by me in an adequate manner, I do hope at the end of the lecture or at the end of my presentation that you will say a few words and ask me a few things so that it gives me the opportunity to deal with those. Normally in Calcutta University I do say a few words in Bengali. কিন্তু আসল মুশকিলটা পুরো আধা ঘন্টা 45 মিনিট বাংলাতে এই রকম একটা বিষয় নিয়ে আলোচনা করার আমার ক্ষমতা নেই। যদিও হতে পারে আমি 5-10 মিনিটের জন্য আমি করতে পারতাম, এই টানা ভালো বাংলার মধ্যে শুধু বাংলা মানে সাধু বাংলার মধ্যে এই নিয়ে আলোচনা করার আমার ভোকাবুলারি নেই, গ্রামার নেই, এইসবগুলো আমার বেশ একটা শর্টেজ ও শর্টফল। তার জন্য যেটা আমি আপনাদেরকে বলতাম বা তোমাদেরকে বলতাম, এই আমার প্রেজেন্টেশনের পরে যদি তোমরা বাংলাতে আমাকে প্রশ্ন করতে চাও, আমি রাজি আছি ওইটাকে শুনতে আর উত্তর দিতে যতটা আমি বাংলাতে আমি পারি। ঠিক আছে? So I will make my presentation primarily in English. The central point of the subject that I've been asked to address is the Russian Revolution and the way in which the Russian Revolution is to be approached at the beginning of the 21st century. If we were standing about 25 years ago, that is 30 years ago, in 1987, there would be no question of this order being raised, in the sense that it would be very clear why a discussion of the Russian Revolution was taking place. In those days, there were two major world powers, one a superpower, one for all intents and purposes an aspiring superpower, that were concerned with the Russian Revolution and took as the Russian Revolution the major departure of the 20th century. In many ways, the major departure of the modern world after the French Revolution. Hence, to go back, or at least to celebrate the occasion, was normal. And I wish to underline, it was as much celebrate as much as to discuss. Hence, the meaning was clear. What was required was to readdress the meaning, to once again find the foundations on which the two states lay, and Cuba obviously was. Cuba, as well as the states of Southeast Asia, were the younger partners in this matter. And also, thereafter, perhaps to raise a few questions, a few memories as you went along. At the beginning of the 21st century, after the fall of the Soviet Union, or the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and the reorientation of Chinese communist policy in order to handle matters of growth in a way in which the Chinese have sought to do with very little reference to the past, the precise implications and value of the Russian Revolution as a model and as a point of reference are not so clear. In your Wall magazine, you have addressed some of these questions, but whatever the case, and we can come back to some of the questions that are raised in the Wall magazine later, whatever the case, the point is that we now stand at a time when, in the course of 2017, there will be a few events in India where Russian studies departments and a few history departments, and perhaps colleges like yours, may actually arrange an occasion to think of the centenary. But by and large, the centenary will go unnoticed in this country, and will probably go unnoticed in many countries where once upon a time the Russian Revolution was a point of reference. Ethiopia, Mozambique, Angola, some of the states of Southeast Asia, such as Cambodia. In all these places, there is a high chance that there will be no ripple, there will be no reference, except amongst a few old stalwarts who used to belong to the communist movement. Once this is said, I think what is important in any history group is at least to find out why the revolution created the ripples that it did. It is very easy simply to say it was a great revolution which created the first socialist state. That socialist state finally withstood one of the most powerful industrial states in the world, i.e. Germany, and its ally Italy during the course of the Second World War, and then constituted itself as a superpower after 1945. Hence, it is worthy of attention, and there can be no doubt that that is true. But that is the history of the Soviet state. It is not the history of the Russian Revolution. Hence, why one should bother with the Russian Revolution rather than the achievement of the Soviet state is one important question here. If you're going to hold a lecture on the Soviet state and its contribution to the 20th century, yes, perhaps, in fact, you may find a few takers, because many people still live from that particular era and have a sense of why the Soviet state affected the countries that it did. But the October Revolution, why should the October Revolution be worthy of attention? Especially when in the 70 years of the Soviet state, the October Revolution finally came to be ritualized and remembered merely as a starting point rather than a source of instruction and a source for reflection. So I think that is an important question. So let us go back to, as they say, to ground zero, to have a look at precisely what it is about this revolution which attracts attention. What is the event itself? Here I think let us just at least look at what the event is. The Russian Revolution, first and foremost, is not simply the October Revolution. The October Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, was the foundations of the Soviet state. But the Russian Revolution, like the French Revolution before it, is not merely one regime that emerged from the Soviet state, that emerged from a process. The French Revolution had Girondins, it had Jacobins, it had Thermidorians, and it had the Napoleonic period. So there were many, many different regimes that are associated with the French Revolution. In the same way, the Russian Revolution has at least three major constituents. The revolution that brought the autocracy to an end, that is between the 25th of February and the 2nd of March, according to the old Russian calendar, which is approximately 13 days behind the calendar that we use. The February Revolution, which brought the autocracy to an end and which established a, shall we say, a popular regime, if not a constitutional and a representative regime in Russia, and which encouraged both an interest in social reform as well as political reform on a scale which had never been there before. Secondly, the October Revolution itself, which as a revolution, that is as an act, did not involve large numbers of people because it was primarily a coup that took place in the city of Petrograd, which was then followed by immediate approval within a matter of 24 hours by the All Russian Congress of Soviets, and which then gradually assumed larger and larger representative proportions as Soviets come to approve of it and fight for it throughout most of what used to be the territories of Imperial Russia during the course of the next 6 months, that is up to March 1918 and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The third phase of the Russian Revolution is normally a period which is considered to be a period of anarchy, but which was probably one of the most important creative periods of the Russian Revolution, in the sense that it was this period which was the foundations of the future socialism which came to underlie the reforms of the late 1920s and the creation of the planned economy and collectivization. This is the period of the Civil War, the period of war communism, which stands from 1918, late 1918, early 1919, through to 1920, when the last major supporter of the anti-Bolshevik faction, Admiral Kolchak, is captured and executed in Siberia. So there are these three phases. But all of them, and the first phase essentially takes shape between the 25th of February and the 2nd of March. The second event essentially takes place over 2 days, in the 25th and the 26th of October and 1917, and the third actually takes place over the course of 2 to 3 years. Together, they constitute the full overhauling and transformation of what used to be the Russian Empire into a new entity, which is called the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, which had already formed its constitution by 1919 and was preparing to form a second constitution in 1923 when it was transformed into the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. So this is the revolution itself. There are some interesting questions here. First and foremost, why do a set of actions which take place in this admittedly very large country concern the whole of the world? Sure, once in fact the 20s are over, the 30s are over, the Second World War has taken place, we are sitting in a situation where the Soviet Union aspires to great power as well as to superpower status after 1945. Then you can say the revolution is meaningful. But it is not that in the year 1917, 18, 19, 20 or 21. In fact, when H.G. Wells speaks after a visit to Russia in 1920, it was to inform the British public that the civilized side of the world's cultures, which used to exist in Russia, has ceased to exist. That is, that Russia has retreated into barbarism, and there is nothing there that is for us to either remember or to refer to. This is a consequence of the enormous travails as well as difficulties of the Civil War period, which culminated finally in the famine and drought of 1921. So there is a question here. Why is it that the revolution is international? Why is it that it came to appeal to large numbers of people? But first and foremost, I think there are some very, very simple issues that we have to bear in mind, which is that the revolution actually brought to power a group of people who in no other country in the world had ever been given power. Hence, it was unheard of that a socialist should hold a portfolio in any of the cabinets of continental Europe before 1917. They simply did not figure in the electoral map. 1918, sure. Once, in fact, the German Revolution takes place, the Socialist Democratic Party of Germany enters the formal arena of executive power, ceases simply to be a power within the Reichstag, a pressure group. In the British House of Commons, the Labour group, James Keir Hardie and others, certainly had no authority until the 1920s. Hence, the Russian Revolution, and here we must take all three revolutions together, brought socialists to power in a manner which was unheard of. Hence, it empowered an ideology which was an ideology which was always a challenger ideology. It had never actually held center stage in any of the countries of continental Europe. Forget about the rest of the world. Please remember that we are dealing at the beginning of the 20th century where even when you have sovereign states, these sovereigns outside Western and Central Europe, these sovereign states are not sovereign states in the sense of commanding world respect and establishing stable regimes which may be called upon to set either models or examples or give some form of instruction, except in the case of Japan, which at that particular time does not seek to give that kind of example at that kind of level. So Japan is not a developmental formula to be imitated. Japan as yet is not a political formula to be imitated simply because it does not seek to be imitated. So there is no alternative except in Western and Central Europe that is to be borne in mind, and there the socialists do not count. So the Russian Revolution, first and foremost, since both in February, because as part of the February Revolution, a system of what we call dual power was established, and both a popular entity, the so-called Petrograd Soviet, and later in June the All-Russian Congress of Soviets was constituted. These two entities actually brought socialists to a position where they had authority. This is one very important thing. Secondly, it is important also to remember that the Russian Revolution constitutionally established for the first time, in a genuine sense, universal suffrage in the world. That is, the Constitution of the United States had not accepted it because it had never accepted women as part of the standard electorate. None of the constitutional arrangements in continental Europe had done that either. More important, the constitutional arrangements in continental Europe, with the exception of Germany and the exception of France, had not accepted even universal adult male suffrage. So it was not accepted in Italy, it was not accepted in Spain, it was certainly not accepted in Britain before 1917, where these arrangements had gradually been moving forward, but as yet they had not assumed the level that the Russians came to assume during the course of the Russian Revolution. So at two levels, certainly, Russia marked a difference and was worth looking at. Not many people perhaps looked at it because the revolution took place in these three phases in the course of the end of the First World War, which was drawing to a close, which would draw to a close in November 1918 in the armistice. And as a result, everybody was too busy fighting to be able to actually think in terms of the meaning of these issues. Or perhaps they did. We'll think about that in a moment. What is important, as I said, is that these two things did make a difference. There was a third aspect to this which made a difference. And this aspect makes the Bolshevik Revolution more important than the February Revolution. The February Revolution undoubtedly was egalitarian, it was democratic, It was reformatory, reform-oriented. It was attempting to create a new society, a democratic society. The Bolshevik Revolution, however, was not simply attempting to establish socialism. The most important thing about the Bolshevik Revolution was that the Bolshevik Revolution seriously considered that the ideology which its leaders had been studying for the past 50 years, half a decade and more, this ideology should be crucial to the state. That is, that they wished to give this particular ideology pride of place. Please remember what the Americans said when they actually waged their own revolution in the 1770s. We shall be a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all mankind shall be upon us. In every sense, the American Revolution sought to establish liberalism as the center of an order which would then be an example. The Bolsheviks wanted to establish socialism at the center of an order which would be an example. That is, amongst those who created the two revolutions and participated in the third in order to establish the Soviet Constitution, there was an aspiration to universalism, exemplary activity, which was also crucial to the Russian Revolution. The third, I've mentioned, in fact, 3 points. So this is the third point, the nature of the revolution itself, which is that it was on the one hand socialist, as socialist. Secondly, that it was democratic in a way in which no democracy had existed before. And thirdly, that it was universalist. That is, it sought to inspire and to act as a reference points for large parts of the world. But if this was by itself the end of all things, one would perhaps even say that, well, that itself is a noble act, but it is no more noble, as it were, than Hugo Chavez actually attempting to establish a regime in Venezuela, which would be an example of Fidel Castro doing the same. There is nothing more to be said about this other than to taste the pudding as you eat it. But no, the Bolsheviks actually, from the year 1990, went even further than this. The Bolsheviks had, first and foremost, the Bolsheviks, by the way, were not sophisticated theoreticians. It's very, very important to remember, however much you may admire a person such as Lenin, that Lenin was no Marx, he was no Nietzsche, he was no Hegel. He was essentially a revolutionary who was extremely well-read and a copious writer. Lenin, by the age of 21, had written his 600-page book on the development of capitalism in Russia. So you can see that certainly writing came very easily to him, and so did much thought, because he would polemicize extensively with a number of European thinkers during this period. But Lenin essentially was the prime ideologue of the Bolshevik Party up to the 1900s. George Plekhanov, Pavel Axelrod, others never wrote as much as Lenin did, nor with that degree of refinement and sophistication, nor did the Bolshevik group of Peter Struve and others. So in fact, if you're looking for ideological scintillation, no, you're not going to find it in Bolshevik literature. Bolshevik literature in that sense was extremely hortatory, it was encouraging, it was deeply analytical, but it was not, in terms of category and in terms of analysis, really brilliant. No, but there is a side to what the Bolsheviks set out to do, which is immensely important, which is they were extremely practical people. If they were going to make socialism universal, then they must make socialism universal in a practical manner. And practical manner, in the Russian case, and the Russians were very good at this, was through the organization of secret societies, parties, and various kinds of political institutions the world over that would actually constitute a revolutionary elan, a particular enthusiasm. For this, within 2 years of the founding of the establishment of a revolutionary project in 1917 October, by the year 1919, the Communist International had been created. The Communist International was of relevance, you may say, only to Western Europe initially, and that is primarily because the Bolsheviks considered that there would be other revolutions in Western Europe. Correctly so, because in fact in 1918 there had been an attempted German revolution, and very shortly after that there was an attempted Hungarian revolution. So the Bolsheviks were not thinking unimaginatively. But by 1920 the Bolsheviks had thought further. By February of 1919 they had decided to intervene in the so-called revolutionary wars, which were taking place in Persia and in India. And by India what they meant is the aftermath of the Rawat Satyagraha, the consequences of the Jallianwala Bagh, i.e. the Amritsar massacre, and similar such instances of the Gandhian activities of the year 1919. So they decided that something was going on even in India. They decided that they must take an interest in it. So the meeting in July 1920 of the Communist International drew in large numbers of people from what we would call the developing world as well. You say, perhaps in fact it was only Persia and India. No, within 3 years you will actually find people from North Africa present. You will find people from sub-Saharan Africa present. Okay? It is one of the most distinguishing features of the Communist International that it drew in by the year 1923, 1924, sections of the African working class as well. So that in fact you have African representatives who are present, as along with Chinese, Mongolians, Japanese, people from Southeast Asia, as well as people from South Asia and the West. Latin Americans, certainly. So the practical level of this project was enormous. Now, perhaps in fact this was all imagination. Perhaps it was just one conference after another conference. Not really. Because the big difference between a Venezuelan project or a Cuban project is that these are small states dealing with limited populations. The one thing that we must continuously remember of the Russia of that period, which by the way is not true of the Russia of our times, is that it was a vast empire and actually looked to many different peoples on its borders. So that in fact there were within the Russian Empire people who were migrant workers from Eastern Europe, that is coming from the states of Romania as well as from Austria-Hungary, etc. on the western side. There were people coming in from Persia who used to work in Azerbaijan and in the Caucasus area. There were Chinese who used to cross the borders and work in eastern Siberia. And there were Afghans and others who tended to work across the border in Central Asia. So actually the revolution was, even in the very place in which it was taking place, grand in the scale of the territory that it was to affect. Any civil war, any collapse of an economy, any restructuring of an economy within this territory was bound to affect both Europe, West Asia and East Asia. The scale was so enormous. So at all these levels, the Bolshevik Revolution, the February Revolution which preceded it, the Civil War which went after it, all of them affected a very, very large mass of the world. Okay? I'll just show you a few shots in a minute to give you a sense of this mass representation. I'll just take a sec before I do that. So, in this sense, there is something very, very important about the Bolshevik Revolution. It is worth remembering. Even more than the French Revolution, which ultimately affected a very important part of the world, but a part of the world ultimately which was not imperial as yet. Okay, the British Empire was just getting off the ground. The French Empire was small. The Dutch Empire was even smaller, and the Iberian empires were about to disintegrate. So, in this sense, the world of the French Revolution and the world of the Russian Revolution were very, very different. The world of the Russian Revolution was grander in scale in terms of the kind of peoples that it was to deal with. So these are certain important points that we can use as a kind of core. The second group of things that we must refer to is that in being universal, in thinking of large issues and large peoples, from the year 1920 onwards, the Bolsheviks were very committed to dealing with all nationalisms the world over. That is, they were not committed purely with establishing a Comintern which would represent socialism. They were not concerned merely with dealing with the peoples on their borders and their neighborhood. They were also concerned with dealing with all the struggling peoples of the world. Hence, when Lenin constituted his theses for the July Congress of the Comintern, he actually looked to all nationalisms, that is, all nationalist parties who were struggling against imperialism in any part of the world and attempted to and wanted to draw them in. He therefore sought out, through a series of embassies and through a series of contacts, such people and brought them to Russia in order to try and constitute for them a communist imagination, a Comintern imagination of how nationalism would receive assistance from the Bolshevik state. So, not only was the Russian Revolution representative of the arrival of socialism, of democracy, of a major change in a critical part of the world which is to be institutionalized and taken out, but it was also going to provide enormous resources from this part of the world to nationalisms the world over. And there is a very important reason for this. The Russian Revolution was being constituted at the height of the First World War in Russia, where the state itself was collapsing and the various capitalist interests itself were increasingly marginalized and alienated. Hence, the Bolsheviks were coming to power with no specific interest on the part of any affluent lobby. The resources of Russia which they were commanding were not to be dedicated to the aspirations of any one class or any one group. And there are two reasons for this. The first of the reasons is that they did not belong to any one particular group, even if you consider that they were primarily the representatives of the working class. Because they represented a coalition from the time of the All Russian Congress of Soviets, which is based on both an intelligentsia which was dissatisfied with the Bolshevik, with the Tsarist state and the provisional government, and by a group of peasant leaders of the Socialist Revolutionary Party who would finally divide and divide again after 1918 in the way in which they supported the Bolsheviks. So they represented a coalition, a large coalition, and most important, they represented a relatively impecunious coalition. They did not have money. They were not used to dealing with money. They would have to persuade banks to teach them how to deal with money in the course of the period after 1917. Most important, and this is the second aspect of the reason why they were less concerned about this issue of interest and what they represented in terms of financial or monetary or material power, is that most of them had always been exiles. Most of them had always been underground. None of them had actually held jobs which integrated them into one particular branch of society. They had been sitting in Zurich, they had been sitting in Geneva, they had been sitting in Paris throughout their lives, or they had been exiles in Siberia. They had always been alienated. It is considered as a result, therefore, and correctly so, that they were not going to uphold the interests of Russia primarily. It was not a Russian revolution in terms of a revolution that spoke only for the Russian interest and its global position. No, even though they may finally have to employ Tsarist officials, they were happy to use everybody else in the way in which they established their establishment. Hence the Comintern, hence the draw on Britons, on Frenchmen, on Southeast Asians, on Indians, on Chinese, on Arabs, and on everybody else in the framework of the establishment of Bolshevik power. So, at all these levels, by the year 1921, you have an event which is considered by its activists to be an event which will supply enormous sums of money to activities throughout the world. Very, very important issue. And to bring it down to tangible, simple levels, let me point out that Avani Mukherjee, one of the most important lieutenants of M.N. Roy, who represented the Indian cause in the Comintern, used to write to other revolutionaries in India stating, we have crores of rupees which have been promised to us. And it is a fact that at least 2 million rupees were given to M.N. Roy when he was in Tashkent in the year 1920, 1921, as he was planning the so-called invasion of the Punjab territories from Afghan country during the course of that particular period. So the actual money we can see is substantial, and even more gold mohurs were promised to the Afghan tribes of Chitral, Dir and Waziristan in order to encourage them to take up arms against the British during this particular period, that is 1920-21. So you're dealing really with very, very tangible display of wealth in the service of socialism in the way in which the revolution set itself to look at the world. Finally, and I want to keep the 15 minutes, because I wanted here to emphasize to you why the revolution is worth thinking about, what it is about it which is so unusual, something that is worth beyond the legacy that it was finally to become encrusted with, that is of the Soviet state and all other people, that it is an event by itself which is worthy of attention. So finally, you are not only made great by your own greatness, but also in a strange way by the criticism of your enemies and the attempt on the part of your enemies to do something about you. There was not a single imperial power between 1917 and 1921 that did not attempt to destroy Soviet Russia. Okay? The War of the Intervention was the classic instance of this attempt to destroy Soviet Russia. Now, there were French troops, there were British troops, there were Japanese troops, and, very important, there were American troops as well, all of whom were involved in the attempt to destroy Soviet Russia. At the tail end, at the beginning of the entire enterprise, of course, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians attempted to do it themselves. But by 1918 November, the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians were out of the picture anyway, because they had been defeated in the First World War. But the actual other major imperial powers were deeply involved in the attempt to undermine Soviet Russia in the first stage between 1917 October and, if we take the Malice mission's withdrawal in February of 1919, March of 1919 as a turning point, the beginning of 1919. So everybody considered this to be a challenge. Later the British would argue it is only in order to save the entire area of Russian operations from the Turks and the Germans that we intervened in this area at all. We were not committed to these issues of anti-socialism during this period. But if you were not committed to these issues of anti-socialism during this period, why do the major statesmen of Britain and France and other states actually encourage their intelligence services to undermine Bolshevik power? Why is it that every time Bolshevik power generates literature elsewhere in the world, you attempt to curb and limit it? These remain important questions. Okay? Right the way from 1919 to 1922, the British in India considered Soviet Russia to be one of their most important threats. Hence the 3 Peshawar conspiracy cases for which, in 1923, for which most of the major people under charge had already been arrested during 1920-1922. Okay? So it is very clear that the event itself inspired enormous fear. It was a major challenge. And it was a challenge for all the reasons that I've mentioned. The scale of the Russian Empire, the commitment of the Soviet state, and the way in which the ideology of the Bolsheviks actually was trained against the imperial powers themselves. So, from this, I think one should and must conclude that other than everything else that happened afterwards, the kind of planned economy that the Bolsheviks generated, the under Stalin, the way in which the Soviet Union became a world power, etc., etc. The revolution itself as an event is worth the study simply because it challenged an entire system of ordering the world, ordering society. For later generations, therefore, forget the Soviet example as a socialist example. Don't even think I think of it as the classic example of socialism. Because to be frank with you, there are many different kinds of socialism, and one I have lived half my professional life debating with people as to whether the Soviet socialist example was socialist at all. And many of them have always pointed out adequately to me that there are many, many questions to be asked on this front. Whether it be in terms of the lack of sophistication of the Bolsheviks concerning their understanding of what socialism meant, or the way in which their socialism was carried into operation by Stalin and his successors. So that to me is not a major issue today. Today for me, a major issue would be to point out to you that it is possible to challenge an existing order and the grandest conceivable scale in terms of global reach and world range. It is possible to actually begin from one particular core and think in very, very large terms, as long as the concept and the idea is well enough evolved and the range is well enough conceived. In many ways, the Russian Revolution, therefore, indicates the promise of that kind of revolution. It is extremely important to remember that the Bolsheviks achieved this target, that the Russian Revolution achieved this target without conquest. There is no state on the borders of Imperial Russia that was conquered by the Bolsheviks in order to create this fear and to inspire this particular aura and this particular imagination that they generated during this period. To all intents and purposes, it was generated primarily using the material at their disposal. Hence, it is possible to think in these terms for major ends which may actually change the course of global destiny for long periods of time. And in that sense, the legacy of the Bolsheviks is not merely the legacy of the Soviet state, but it is a legacy that actually should be respected because it indicates the capacity in the modern world to actually alter the course of politics and economics in directions which may be more fruitful to mankind. Perhaps that's a questionable benefit. And obviously there were many who actually questioned the Bolshevik agenda. But certainly there is no question that it is possible and perhaps even worthy of pursuit. There are questions that remain. Does this encourage fanaticism? The kind of questions which I'm talking about, may they not all